I still remember the morning when everything inside me finally went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something breaks so deeply that even anger gets tired. I was sitting alone in my car, parked outside the office building where I had worked for almost 12 years. The engine was off. My hands were resting on the steering wheel, but I was not ready to go inside. I stared at my reflection in the windshield and barely recognized the man looking back at me. That man looked older than he should have. His eyes carried a heaviness that sleep could not fix. His shoulders were slightly slumped, like he had been carrying a weight for far too long and had finally forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. That morning, my boss was going to present a project to the executive team. A project I had built from the ground up. A project with my ideas, my late nights, my weekends, my quiet sacrifices. And my name was nowhere on it. I knew it before I even stepped out of the car. I had known it for weeks. But knowing something and accepting it are two very different things. As I sat there, I thought about how strange life can be. How you can do everything right. Show up early. Stay late. Keep your head down. Be loyal. Be patient. And still end up feeling invisible. People think betrayal is always loud. Arguments. Shouting. Doors slamming. But sometimes betrayal is quiet. It happens in meeting rooms with polite smiles and PowerPoint slides. It happens when someone else says, "I," while talking about work you poured your soul into. I took a deep breath and finally opened the car door. The building looked the same as it always had. Glass walls, neutral colors, a company logo polished to perfection. From the outside, it was a place that promised stability and respect. From the inside, it was where I slowly learned how easily hard work can be claimed by someone louder, someone higher up, someone protected by a title. As I walked toward the entrance, memories started flooding in. Not just about the job, but about the life that had led me here. The choices I had made. The people I had tried to provide for. The promises I had kept, even when it hurt. Because this story is not just about my boss. It is about my family. It is about the quiet deals I made with myself. It is about how long I stayed silent and why. I grew up in a small, working-class household. Nothing dramatic. Nothing tragic. Just ordinary struggles. My father worked with his hands. Long hours. Calloused fingers. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words stayed with you. One thing he used to say often was, "If you work hard and keep your head down, people will notice." He believed that deeply. So did I. My mother believed in patience, in endurance, in holding things together no matter what. She believed that making a fuss only made life harder. I learned early that keeping peace often meant swallowing discomfort. Those lessons shaped me more than I realized. When I went to college, I did not chase big dreams. I chased stability. I studied something practical, something safe. I was not the loudest student. I was not the most confident, but I was consistent. Professors knew they could rely on me. Group projects always landed on my shoulders because I would finish them, no matter what. That pattern followed me into adulthood. I met my wife in my mid-20s. She was warm, thoughtful, and steady. We bonded over simple things. Long walks. Quiet dinners, talking about the future in soft, careful tones. She admired my dedication. I admired her calm strength. When we got married, we promised each other a simple life built on trust. No drama, no games, just effort and honesty. When our children were born, my sense of responsibility grew heavier, but also clearer. Everything I did became about providing, about being dependable, about making sure they never had to worry the way I once did. So when I got the job at the company that would later take so much from me, I felt grateful, truly grateful. It was not a dream job, but it was solid. Good salary, health insurance, growth potential. I told myself that if I gave it my best, it would give my family security. At first, it did feel fair. My boss back then was different. He noticed effort. He asked questions. He encouraged ideas. I worked hard, and it showed. Promotions came slowly, but they came. I felt seen. Then things changed. A restructuring happened. New leadership. New priorities. That was when my current boss arrived. Let's call him Daniel. Daniel was charming in meetings. Confident. Well-spoken. He knew how to sound impressive without saying much. People listened when he talked. Executives liked him. He had that polished confidence that made others assume competence. At first, I admired him. He took an interest in my work early on. Asked me to explain my process. Complimented my attention to detail. I thought it was a good sign. I thought he wanted to mentor me. What I did not realize was that he was also watching how quiet I was, how unlikely I was to challenge him, how easily I deferred credit. The first time he took credit for my work, it was small. A meeting with another department. A concept I had mentioned casually. He repeated it as if it were his own. People nodded. I noticed it, but I told myself it did not matter. It was a team effort, right? The second time, it stung a little more. A report I had spent weeks refining. He presented it without mentioning my name. I sat there, listening to praise meant for me land on him. I felt something twist in my chest, but I stayed quiet. I told myself it would balance out eventually, that my time would come. I was wrong. As months passed, it became a pattern. My ideas, my frameworks, my solutions, always filtered through his voice, always framed as his leadership. I started working harder, thinking that undeniable results would force recognition. Late nights became normal. Weekends blurred into weekdays. My wife noticed the change before I did. "You're always tired," she said one evening as I rubbed my temples at the dinner table. "I'm just busy," I replied. She looked at me for a long moment. Busy is fine, but invisible is not. I brushed it off. I did not want to worry her. I did not want to admit that something felt wrong. At work, I stayed polite, professional, supportive. I told myself that patience was strength. Inside, something was slowly wearing down. I began to doubt myself. Maybe this was normal. Maybe this was how companies worked. Maybe I was being sensitive. But then came the project, the one that would change everything. It started as a problem no one wanted to touch. A failing system, missed targets, client complaints. Management wanted a solution, fast. Daniel brought it to me quietly. "I trust your judgment," he said, leaning against my desk. "See what you can do." I threw myself into it. I analyzed data late into the night. I spoke to people across departments. I mapped processes. I rebuilt workflows. Slowly, carefully, I created something solid. Something that worked. When results started showing, Daniel smiled more in meetings. He spoke with confidence about his strategy. I noticed the language shift. But by then, I was too deep to stop. At home, my kids asked why I was always on my laptop. My wife stopped asking after a while. I kept going because I believed that when the project succeeded, the truth would be obvious. I did not realize how naive that belief was. The presentation day was scheduled weeks in advance. Daniel asked me to prepare the materials. Slides, charts, talking points. I did it all. The night before, I stayed up late reviewing everything one last time. I felt proud. Exhausted, but proud. That morning, sitting in my car, I already knew what would happen. Still, a small part of me hoped I was wrong. I walked into the building, greeted colleagues, and took my seat in the conference room. Daniel stood at the front, confident and calm. The executives filed in. As the presentation began, I listened carefully. He spoke about the problem, then the solution, then the results. Every word was familiar. Every idea was mine, and my name was never said. I watched faces light up. I heard praise, approval, plans for expansion, and something inside me finally settled. Not anger, not rage, just a deep, heavy understanding. This was not a mistake. This was who he was, and this was who I had allowed myself to be. As the meeting ended, people congratulated Daniel. He accepted it gracefully. He did not look at me. I walked back to my desk in silence. That was the moment I realized that staying quiet had cost me more than credit. It had cost me respect, self-respect. But I still did not speak up. Not yet. Because when you have spent your whole life believing that patience will save you, it takes time to accept that silence can also destroy you. And that was only the beginning. After that meeting, nothing looked different on the outside. People still laughed near the coffee machine. Emails still came in with polite greetings. Calendars stayed full. Deadlines stayed tight. The company kept moving forward as if nothing important had happened. But inside me, something had shifted. I started noticing things I had ignored for years. The way my shoulders stayed tense even after I got home. The way I checked my phone during dinner, not because I had to, but because I felt guilty if I didn't. The way I listened to my children talk while my mind stayed somewhere else, stuck on unfinished tasks and unspoken thoughts. That night, after the presentation, I came home later than usual. The house was quiet. The lights in the living room were dim, and the television was on low volume. My wife was sitting on the couch, her legs pulled up under her, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. She looked up when I walked in. "How did it go?" she asked. I loosened my tie slowly, buying myself time. "It went fine," I said. She studied my face. She had always been good at that, better than I liked sometimes. "Just fine?" she asked gently. I nodded and walked into the kitchen. I opened the fridge even though I wasn't hungry. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at shelves without seeing them. When I turned around, she was standing in the doorway. "They liked it," I said, still avoiding her eyes. "The project. I'm glad," she replied. "You worked hard on it." There it was. That sentence. You worked hard on it. Something tightened in my chest. I shrugged. It's part of the job. She didn't push. She never did. Instead, she stepped closer and placed a hand on my arm. "You don't sound happy," she said quietly. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to say that my boss had taken credit for my work again, that I felt invisible, that I felt foolish for believing effort alone was enough. But the words stayed stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. "I'm just tired," I said. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That night, I lay awake long after she fell asleep. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the meeting again and again in my mind. Every slide, every sentence, every moment where I could have spoken up and didn't. I asked myself the same question over and over. Why didn't I say anything? The answer was never simple. I was afraid of being seen as difficult, afraid of risking stability, afraid of making waves, afraid of losing the job that paid the mortgage and kept food on the table. Fear has a quiet voice. It doesn't shout. It whispers reasonable things. It tells you that silence is smart, that patience is maturity, that speaking up is reckless. I had listened to that voice my entire life. The next morning, I went back to work as if nothing had happened. I answered emails, attended meetings, smiled when expected. Daniel walked past my desk and gave me a quick nod, like we were perfectly aligned. "Good work," he said. 2 words. No details. No acknowledgement. I nodded back. That became the rhythm of my days. At home, I became more distant. Not because I wanted to be, but because I didn't know how to explain what I was carrying. I didn't want my frustration to spill into the one place that still felt safe. My kids noticed before I did. One evening, my son asked, "Dad, why are you always working?" I smiled and said something about providing for the family. He frowned. "But you're here, and you're still working." That stayed with me. My daughter started doing her homework quietly at the kitchen table, glancing up at me from time to time. I could see questions in her eyes she didn't know how to ask. I told myself this was temporary, that things would change, that recognition would come eventually. Weeks turned into months. At work, Daniel's confidence grew. He was invited into higher-level meetings. His name started appearing in internal newsletters. He talked about his leadership style and his vision, using language I had heard him borrow directly from me. I started to feel like a ghost in my own work. Colleagues came to me for help, but praised him for the results. I listened to conversations where my ideas were discussed as if they belonged to someone else. Each time, I swallowed the discomfort and kept going. I told myself that loyalty mattered, that being dependable mattered, but something else was happening beneath the surface. I was losing my sense of worth. I began to second-guess my ideas. I spoke less in meetings. I stopped volunteering suggestions and less asked directly. I watched others take space while I shrank into myself. Daniel noticed. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk again. "You've been quiet lately," he said casually. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just focused." "Good," he replied. "I like that about you. Reliable. Steady. Reliable. Steady." Those words used to sound like compliments. Now they felt like labels. Boxes I had allowed myself to be placed in. At home, my wife finally said something I couldn't ignore. "You're not yourself," she said one night after the kids were asleep. "You're here, but you're not really here." I sighed and sat down across from her. "I don't want to bring work home," I said. "I know," she replied. "But you already are. You just aren't talking about it." I looked at her hands resting on the table. The same hands that had supported me for years, that had held our children, that had carried so much quietly. "He takes credit for my work," I said suddenly. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. She looked up. "Who?" "My boss. Daniel." I told her everything then. Slowly, carefully, I explained the meetings, the presentations, the way my name disappeared from things I had built. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. "That's not right," she said. I nodded. "I know. Then why do you let it happen?" That question landed harder than any criticism ever could. I didn't have a good answer. "I don't want to lose my job," I said finally. She reached across the table and took my hand. "And what are you losing by staying silent?" I didn't respond. Because the truth was painful. I was losing myself. The next few weeks were some of the hardest I've ever lived through. Not because of dramatic events, but because of the slow realization that I had built my entire identity around being useful to others. I was the dependable employee, the supportive husband, the patient father, the man who didn't complain. And somewhere along the way, I had confused silence with strength. At work, another opportunity came up. A new initiative. High visibility. Career defining. Daniel assigned it to me again. "I'll need you to lead the groundwork," he said. "I'll handle the executive side." I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to say no. I worked harder than ever. Not because I believed in the system anymore, but because I didn't know how to stop. Late one night, while reviewing documents alone in the office, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back at me looked tired. Not just physically, but emotionally. I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What example am I setting for my children? Was I teaching them that effort mattered? Or was I teaching them that it was okay to be overlooked? The answer scared me. The project progressed quickly. Success followed. Praise followed Daniel again. And something inside me finally reached its limit. Not in a dramatic way. Not with anger or shouting. It was quieter than that. I stopped caring. I still did my job well. But the emotional attachment was gone. The hope that recognition would come if I just waited a little longer had faded. That was when I started to see things clearly. Daniel wasn't stealing my work because he was powerful. He was doing it because I allowed it. That realization hurt more than anything he had done. I had always believed that integrity would protect me. That fairness would eventually balance things out. But integrity without boundaries had only made me easy to use. One evening, after another long day, my wife asked me a simple question. "What do you want?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. I had spent so many years doing what was expected of me that I had forgotten how to listen to myself. That question stayed with me. I started writing things down. Not plans. Not complaints. Just thoughts. Feelings I had never voiced. Frustrations I had minimized for too long. And slowly, something changed. I began to understand that speaking up didn't mean being aggressive. That setting boundaries didn't mean being ungrateful. That telling the truth didn't make me weak. But understanding something and acting on it are very different things. I wasn't ready yet. Because before the truth could speak, I needed to fall completely silent inside. And that fall was closer than I realized. There is a moment in every long struggle when the weight stops being something you carry and becomes something that presses down on you from all sides. You no longer feel like you are moving forward or backward. You feel stuck, held in place by expectations, habits, and fear. That was where I found myself. After that second major project wrapped up, the one Daniel once again presented as his own, the office felt different to me. Not because anything had changed around me, but because my eyes were finally open. I saw patterns instead of isolated incidents. I saw how often my work appeared under someone else's name. I saw how praise flowed upward, never sideways or down. I also saw myself more clearly. I saw how often I stayed quiet, even when something felt wrong. I saw how quickly I made excuses for other people's behavior. I saw how deeply I believed that endurance alone was a virtue. At first, this awareness felt empowering. Like maybe now that I understood what was happening, I could adjust, protect myself, do things differently. But awareness without action can be painful. Every morning, I still drove to the same building, parked in the same spot, walked past the same glass doors, smiled at the same people. On the surface, nothing changed. Inside, everything felt heavier. Daniel leaned on me more than ever. He trusted me, he said. He relied on me, he said. He appreciated my consistency, he said. And every time he said those things, I felt a strange mix of pride and resentment. Pride because part of me still wanted to be seen as valuable. Resentment because I knew how that value was being used. He started bringing me into meetings early, before others arrived. Not to include me in decision-making, but to prepare me. To ask for input. To gather ideas he could later present as conclusions he had reached on his own. I noticed the way he spoke differently when executives were around. How his posture changed. How his voice grew more confident. How he rarely used words like "we" when discussing successes. One afternoon, after a long strategy session, I lingered behind as others left the room. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady but careful, "about the presentation next week. Do you want me to join you?" He paused, then smiled. I don't think that'll be necessary, but I'll let them know the team did great work. The team. I nodded, even though disappointment burned quietly in my chest. That night, at home, my wife noticed my silence again. You're thinking too hard, she said gently as we cleaned up after dinner. I'm just tired, I replied, the familiar phrase slipping out automatically. She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. You keep saying that, but this feels different. I leaned against the counter and finally admitted something I had been avoiding. I don't know how to fix this, I said. If I speak up, I risk everything. If I stay quiet, I lose myself. She dried her hands and came closer. You've already been losing yourself, she said softly. The question is how much more you're willing to lose. Her words stayed with me. At work, the pressure continued to build. Deadlines tightened. Expectations grew. Daniel promised outcomes that required even more of my time and energy. He spoke confidently about deliverables I knew would take nights and weekends to complete. I stopped saying yes automatically. At least, I tried to. I'll need more time, I said once during a planning session. Daniel looked surprised. You've always managed before. I know, I replied. But this scope is different. He smiled, the polite kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. I trust you'll figure it out. That was his way of ending the conversation. So I figured it out. I always did. But something had changed in me. I no longer felt pride in solving impossible problems. I felt tired, used, replaceable. Colleagues started noticing my withdrawal. A few asked if I was okay. Others simply stopped involving me in conversations that used to include me. I was still useful, but less visible, less present. At home, my children grew older, and with that came new questions. Questions about fairness, about standing up for yourself, about what it means to be respected. One evening, my son came home upset after a disagreement at school. He took credit for my idea, he said, his voice tight. And the teacher believed him. I listened quietly as he explained what happened. I nodded. I offered comfort. I told him it wasn't fair. Then he asked, what should I have done? I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. Because I realized I didn't know how to teach him something I hadn't learned myself. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that invites honesty if you're brave enough to accept it. I thought about the man I wanted my children to see when they looked at me. I thought about the lessons I was teaching without words. I thought about how often I told them to be confident while modeling silence. The next day at work, something small happened that felt bigger than it should have. Daniel sent out an email praising the success of a recent initiative. He thanked several people by name. Mine wasn't included. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the worst time. But for some reason, it hurt more than usual. I closed my email and leaned back in my chair. I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest. The same one I had been carrying for months. Years, maybe. I realized then that this wasn't about one boss or one job. This was about a pattern I had lived with my entire life. I had learned early on that being agreeable kept things calm, that being reliable earned approval, that making yourself small avoided conflict. Those lessons had served me once. They had helped me survive, build a family, create stability, but they were no longer serving me. They were suffocating me. Later that week, Daniel called me into his office. We've got another opportunity, he said, leaning back in his chair. High stakes, high visibility. I nodded, already knowing what was coming. I'll need you to take point on the analysis, he continued. We'll review progress regularly. I took a breath. Will my role be visible this time? The question hung in the air between us. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. Not anger. More like surprise mixed with mild irritation. Why wouldn't it be, he asked. I just want clarity, I replied. About expectations. About credit. He smiled again, that same controlled smile. You're part of the team, he said. We succeed together. I nodded, but something inside me knew better. That conversation marked a turning point, even though nothing outwardly dramatic happened. It was the first time I had named the issue, even quietly. And once something is named, it can't be ignored so easily. From that point on, every interaction felt heavier. Every request felt loaded. I found myself replaying conversations in my head, analyzing tone and wording, wondering what was implied rather than said. The work itself no longer energized me. It drained me. I started making mistakes. Small ones. Missed details. Delayed responses. Nothing serious, but enough to notice. Enough to make me question myself. Daniel noticed too. "You don't seem as sharp lately," he said one afternoon. "Everything okay at home?" The implication stung. "Everything's fine," I replied. But it wasn't. At home, my wife watched me with quiet concern. She didn't push. She never forced conversations. But her presence reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt trapped. One night, she asked, "If nothing changes, can you keep doing this?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about the years ahead, about waking up every morning with the same heaviness, about teaching my children, silently, that their worth depended on being useful, not respected. "No," I said finally. "I can't." Saying that out loud scared me, because admitting you can't continue means admitting something has to change, and change always comes with risk. At work, the pressure reached a breaking point. Deadlines overlapped. Expectations conflicted. Daniel made promises without consulting me, then expected me to deliver. One evening, alone in the office again, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not explosive anger. Not loud anger. But a steady, controlled anger that sharpened my thoughts instead of clouding them. I looked at the documents on my screen. My work. My ideas. My effort. And for the first time, I didn't think about how to make things smoother for everyone else. I thought about myself. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. But I knew one thing with certainty. I could no longer pretend that silence was protecting me. It was protecting everyone else. And the pressure of that realization was becoming impossible to ignore. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. It settles deeper than the body. It lives in the chest, in the space where motivation used to be. I woke up with that tiredness every morning now. Not just before work, but before everything. I still went through the motions. Shower, coffee, breakfast with the kids, a quick kiss for my wife before heading out. From the outside, I looked like a man who had his life together. Inside, I felt like I was slowly coming apart in ways no one could see. Work had stopped being just work. It felt like a test I was failing every day without knowing the rules. Daniel's expectations were higher than ever. He spoke with confidence about deadlines that were impossible. He promised outcomes that depended entirely on me, quietly making miracles happen. And I did, over and over again. But every success felt emptier than the last. I noticed how my body reacted now. My shoulders stayed tense even at home. My jaw clenched without me realizing it. I felt restless when I tried to relax, like I was doing something wrong by not being productive. One evening, while sitting on the couch with my wife, she reached over and placed her hand on mine. "You're shaking," she said softly. I looked down and saw it then. A slight tremor in my fingers. Barely noticeable, but there. "I'm fine," I said quickly, pulling my hand away. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with a sadness that hurt more than any criticism. Later that night, I sat alone in the dark and wondered how I had reached a point where my own body was trying to tell me something my mind refused to accept. At work, things grew more strained. Daniel had started including me in fewer visible meetings, while increasing my workload behind the scenes. It was as if he wanted my output without my presence, my contribution without my voice. During one meeting, a junior colleague presented an idea that I had shared privately with Daniel weeks earlier. He praised the presentation enthusiastically. I sat there, listening, feeling something tighten in my chest. Afterward, the colleague thanked Daniel for his guidance. Daniel smiled. I said nothing. The silence tasted bitter. That afternoon, I retreated into my work, burying myself in tasks that no one else wanted. Data cleanup, process documentation, problem solving no one would notice unless it failed. I had become the person who prevented disasters, not the one celebrated for success. At home, my children felt farther away, even though we shared the same space. I listened to their stories, nodded at the right moments, but my mind was always somewhere else. One night, my daughter asked if I would help her with a school project. I agreed, but as she explained it, I realized I hadn't heard half of what she said. She noticed. "Dad," she said quietly, "are you mad at me?" The question hit me hard. "No," I said quickly. "Never." "Then why do you look like that?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. I hugged her instead, holding on longer than usual. She hugged me back, then pulled away with a smile, as if everything was fine. But it wasn't. My wife and I started having conversations we had avoided for years. Not arguments. Just honest, Difficult talks that left us both quiet afterward. "You don't have to stay somewhere that hurts you," she said one night. "I know," I replied. "But walking away isn't simple." She nodded. "Neither is disappearing slowly." That sentence stayed with me. At work, a new performance review cycle began. Daniel scheduled a one-on-one meeting with me. I walked into his office feeling tense. He sat behind his desk, reviewing notes on his screen. "You've been a strong contributor," he began. "Dependable as always." I waited. "But," he continued, "I'd like to see more leadership from you. More visibility." I almost laughed. "I'd welcome that," I said carefully. He looked up. "Then you should speak up more in meetings. Put yourself out there." I stared at him, unsure whether to feel angry or confused. "I do," I said quietly, "when I'm invited." He paused, then leaned back. "Well, opportunities come to those who take initiative." The conversation ended shortly after. I left his office feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I had said something true. Heavier because I knew it wouldn't change anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the review in my mind. The contradictions. The expectations that ignored reality. I realized something then. Daniel didn't see me as a threat. He didn't see me as a partner. He saw me as a resource. And resources are meant to be used. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me sad. I had given this job my best years. My energy. My creativity. And I had done it willingly, believing that effort would lead to respect. Instead, it had led to exhaustion. A few days later, I made a mistake. A small one, but visible. A deadline slipped by a few hours. Daniel noticed immediately. He called me into his office. "This isn't like you," he said, his tone sharp. "We can't afford delays." "I understand," I replied. "I've been handling multiple priorities." He sighed. "That's part of the job." I nodded, but inside, something cracked. For the first time, I didn't apologize. I walked back to my desk and sat there for a long time without opening my computer. I stared at the screen, blank, reflecting my face back at me. I thought about the man I used to be. The one who believed that being good and patient was enough. The one who thought fairness would naturally follow effort. I thought about my father's words. "Work hard and keep your head down. People will notice." Maybe they had noticed. Maybe they had noticed that I wouldn't push back. At home that evening, my wife asked how my day went. "It was fine," I said automatically. She raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to protect me from the truth." I took a deep breath. "I don't think they respect me," I said. She nodded slowly. "Do you respect yourself there?" The question stung because I already knew the answer. Over the next few weeks, my health began to suffer in ways I couldn't ignore. Headaches became frequent. Sleep came in short bursts. My patience thinned, even though I tried to hide it. One morning, I snapped at my son for something minor. The look on his face stopped me cold. "I'm sorry," I said immediately. He nodded, but the moment lingered. That was when I realized that this job wasn't just taking from me. It was spilling into my family, touching people who had done nothing to deserve it. At work, Daniel announced another major initiative, another chance for growth, another demand on my time. As he spoke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not hope, just clarity. I understood then that I couldn't keep holding everything together. That something had to give. That pretending was costing me too much. I didn't know yet what I would do. I didn't have a plan or a speech prepared. But I knew this. I was reaching the edge of something. And when you reach the edge, you either step back into the familiar pain or step forward into the unknown. I went home that night quieter than usual. My wife noticed. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I replied. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed my hands flat on the surface, grounding myself. "I can't keep doing this," I said. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Then we'll figure out what comes next," she said. For the first time in a long while, I believed her. But the fall hadn't happened yet. And when it did, it would force the truth out into the open in ways I never expected. There is a strange thing that happens when you live under pressure for too long. You stop noticing how heavy it is. You adapt. You normalize the discomfort. You tell yourself this is just how life feels now. And then one small moment comes along and breaks you in a way you never saw coming. For me, it wasn't a shout. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was an email. I was at my desk early that morning, earlier than most people, like always. The office was quiet in that way it only is before the day officially begins. Lights were dim. Coffee machines hummed softly. For a brief moment, I felt calm. Then I opened my inbox. The email was from Daniel. Copied on it were several senior executives. The subject line mentioned the new initiative, the one I had been working on for months, the one that had taken every spare hour I had left. I started reading. After careful planning and strategic leadership, I'm proud to share the progress we've made. I scrolled. My stomach tightened. The language was polished, confident, clean. Every key idea, every solution, every turning point, all framed as his direction, his decisions, his vision. I searched the email for my name. It wasn't there. Not once. At the bottom, there was a line thanking the team for their support. The team. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands resting on the keyboard, unmoving. I didn't feel angry at first. I felt empty, like something had finally drained out of me completely. I thought about the nights I stayed late while the cleaning staff worked around me, the weekends I missed family breakfasts, the times I told my kids just 5 more minutes, and meant it, even when it broke my heart. All of it had been reduced to nothing more than a vague acknowledgement. Something inside me shifted then. Not dramatically, not explosively. It was quieter than that. I closed my email. I leaned back in my chair. And for the first time in years, I didn't rush to open the next task. I sat there and asked myself a question I had been avoiding for a long time. What am I doing? The rest of the morning passed in a blur. People arrived. Conversations happened around me. Someone laughed nearby. Someone complained about traffic. The world moved on as usual. I felt like I was standing still. Around mid-morning, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Did you see the email?" he asked casually. "Yes," I said. "Good," he replied. "The response has been positive so far." I nodded. He lingered for a moment, then added, "We'll need to keep the momentum going." Something in me snapped then. Not violently, just cleanly. "I should have been mentioned," I said. The words surprised both of us. Daniel blinked. "What?" "In the email," I continued, my voice steady. "The work, the ideas, they came from me. I should have been mentioned." There was a pause. He smiled, but this time it felt different. Tighter. Controlled. "You're part of the team," he said. "This isn't about individual credit." I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as a mentor. Not as a leader. But as someone protecting his own image. "I understand teamwork," I said. "But this keeps happening." He straightened slightly. "Are you saying I've done something wrong?" I took a breath. "I'm saying I feel invisible." Silence filled the space between us. People nearby pretended not to notice. Daniel's tone cooled. "If you're unhappy here, we can talk about expectations. But this isn't the place for personal grievances." Then he walked away. I sat there for a long time after that. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. From clarity. I had finally said something. And the world hadn't ended. But I also knew something else. Nothing would change. That afternoon, I couldn't focus. My hands moved, but my mind was elsewhere. I replayed the conversation over and over, analyzing every word, wondering if I had crossed a line, wondering if I had waited too long. When I got home that evening, my wife noticed immediately. "You said something," she said. I nodded. I told her everything. The email, the conversation, the way he dismissed me. She listened quietly, then asked, "How do you feel?" I thought for a moment. "Relieved," I said. "And scared." She smiled softly. "That usually means you told the truth." That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced with possibilities. Retaliation. Being sidelined further. Losing my job. But beneath the fear was something else. A sense of dignity I hadn't felt in a long time. The next few days confirmed what I already suspected. Daniel became distant. Communication went through others. Meetings happened without me. Work I had once been central to was reassigned. I wasn't fired. I wasn't confronted. I was simply erased. The silence this time wasn't mine. It hurt more than I expected. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked relieved that the tension wasn't aimed at them. I went home each day feeling smaller. One evening, my son asked, "Did something happen at work?" I hesitated, then said, "Yes, but I'll be okay." He nodded, then said something I didn't expect. "I'm glad you said something," he said. I looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's not fair when someone takes what isn't theirs," he replied. I felt something warm rise in my chest. Pride. Sadness. Hope. At work, weeks passed like this. Quiet. Uncomfortable. Heavy. Then one morning, I was called into a meeting with human resources. Daniel was there. So was someone I didn't recognize. The conversation was polite. Formal. Carefully worded. They talked about restructuring, about shifting priorities, about role alignment. In simple terms, my position was being redefined. I listened quietly, nodding at appropriate moments. Inside, something settled. This was it. They offered me options. A lateral move. Reduced responsibilities. Same pay. Less visibility. It was framed as an opportunity. I asked for time to think. That evening, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids were asleep. "If you stay," she said gently, "what happens?" I pictured it instantly. More silence. More shrinking. More quiet resentment. "And if you leave?" she asked. I pictured uncertainty. Fear. Risk. But also space. "I don't know," I said. "But I know I can't disappear any more than I already have." She reached for my hand. "Then maybe the truth has already spoken," she said. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next day, I declined the offer. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a speech. I simply said no. Daniel looked surprised, maybe even unsettled. I walked out of the building later that day with a box in my arms and a strange mix of grief and relief in my chest. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. The fall had happened, and somehow, I was still standing. Leaving the building that day felt unreal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just quiet. The box in my arms was lighter than I expected. A few notebooks, a framed photo of my family, a coffee mug I never liked, but kept anyway. 12 years of work reduced to objects that barely filled my hands. As I walked toward the parking lot, no one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. No one said goodbye. That silence hurt more than any argument could have. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief right away either. Mostly, I felt empty, like I had stepped out of a life I knew how to survive in and into a space with no clear shape yet. When I got home early that afternoon, my wife was surprised to see me. "You're home," she said, standing in the doorway. "I'm done," I replied. She didn't ask questions. She stepped forward and hugged me. I stood there holding her, finally allowing myself to feel how tired I really was. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table and talked quietly. Not about plans, not about money, just about how it felt. "I feel like I failed," I admitted. She shook her head. "You stopped failing yourself." The days that followed were harder than I expected. Without the constant noise of work, everything I had been avoiding came rushing in. Doubt, fear, guilt, questions I didn't have answers to. Had I waited too long? Had I misread the situation? Had I overreacted? I replayed every interaction with Daniel in my mind. Every moment where I stayed quiet. Every moment where I spoke up too late. I woke up early out of habit, only to remember I had nowhere to go. The realization hit me fresh each morning. My children noticed the change too. "Are you on vacation?" my daughter asked. I smiled weakly. Something like that. At night, when the house was quiet, the fear crept in strongest. The kind of fear that doesn't shout, but sits beside you and asks uncomfortable questions. What if I can't find something else? What if I made a mistake? What if I put my family at risk? My wife sensed it even when I didn't speak. "We'll be okay," she said one night, squeezing my hand. "We always are." I wanted to believe her. Most days I did. But there were moments when the weight of uncertainty felt heavier than any workload ever had. I started looking for new opportunities slowly, updating my resume, reaching out to old contacts, writing cover letters that felt strange after so many years. Each rejection email stung more than I expected, not because I thought I deserved better, but because part of me worried Daniel had been right, that I was only valuable when someone else spoke for me. Then something unexpected happened. An old colleague reached out. "I heard what happened," she said over the phone. "I just wanted you to know. People noticed." "Not enough," I replied bitterly. "More than you think," she said. "You just weren't in the room when they talked about it." That conversation stayed with me. I started to see my past differently, not as a series of failures, but as evidence of quiet competence, of consistency, of integrity that didn't need to be loud to exist. I spent more time with my children, walked them to school, helped with homework, ate dinner without checking my phone. One evening, my son said, "You smile more now." I hadn't realized I did. The fear didn't disappear, but it softened. It became something I could carry instead of something that carried me. Weeks turned into months. Then one afternoon, an email came in. An opportunity. A smaller company. Less prestige. But the role description caught my attention. They wanted someone who could build systems from the ground up. Someone dependable. Someone thoughtful. Someone like me. The interview process was different from anything I had experienced before. They asked how I worked, how I handled conflict, what mattered to me. For the first time, I answered honestly. I talked about boundaries, about collaboration, about credit. They listened. When the offer came, it wasn't perfect, but it felt fair. I accepted. On my first day, I walked into a modest office. No glass walls, no polished slogans, just people doing their work. My new manager shook my hand and said, "We're glad you're here. We've heard great things." I felt something tighten in my chest. This time, it wasn't pain. It was recognition. I didn't become a different person overnight. I was still quiet, still thoughtful, still careful, but I spoke up sooner. I named my contributions. I set boundaries gently, but clearly. And when I did, the world didn't fall apart. Months later, I ran into Daniel by chance. A brief moment, a polite nod, nothing more. I realized then that I no longer needed his acknowledgement. The truth had spoken, not loudly, not publicly, but clearly enough. I went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with my wife. "I think I'm okay now," I said. She smiled. "I knew you would be." The lesson stayed with me. Silence is not always strength. Patience is not always wisdom. And dignity doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being honest with yourself. I didn't lose everything when I walked away. I found myself. The first few months in my new role felt strange, but in a good way. There was a quiet freedom I hadn't felt in years. No one was taking credit for my work. No one was watching to see how much I could endure. The pace was steady. The expectations were clear. And for the first time in a long time, my effort felt meaningful. I arrived at the office and greeted people by name. I knew their strengths. I asked questions, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to understand. My ideas were valued, and when they were implemented, recognition came not as a courtesy, but as truth. It was subtle at first, just nods and thanks in meetings. But it grew into genuine acknowledgement from colleagues and supervisors alike. At home, the change was even more profound. I stopped carrying the tension from work into our living room. Dinner became more than a hurried task. My children began sharing things with me again. Their school projects, small victories, little disappointments, and I listened. Really listened. I laughed more. I stopped apologizing for being tired when I wasn't. One night, my son asked, "Dad, why didn't you leave your old job sooner?" I hesitated. There was a truth in that question I wasn't ready to voice immediately. "I thought I could handle it," I said slowly. "I thought if I was patient enough, it would get better." He frowned, trying to understand. "But sometimes," I continued, "being patient doesn't fix everything. Sometimes you have to step away to protect yourself, even if it's scary." He nodded thoughtfully. That moment stayed with me. I realized that my experience, painful as it had been, had given me a lesson that words alone could never teach. It had taught me the value of respect for myself and from others. It had taught me that boundaries are not selfish. And it had taught me that silence is not always courage. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt my daily routines around this new understanding. I started waking up earlier, not to work endlessly, but to have a calm hour before the world demanded anything from me. I walked my children to school. I made time for conversation with my wife that wasn't rushed or distracted. I allowed myself small pleasures I had ignored for years. Cooking a meal, listening to music, even reading before bed. These were acts of reclaiming pieces of me I had forgotten existed. At work, I started volunteering for projects, but differently this time. I spoke openly about my ideas. I shared credit with those who deserved it. I learned to say no without guilt. And I watched how the dynamic changed. People respected me not because I was the quiet, hard-working man who never complained, but because I was consistent and clear about what I contributed and what I expected in return. I began journaling, something I had done sporadically in college but abandoned in my 20s. Writing allowed me to unpack my thoughts and fears in a safe place. I reflected on every chapter of my career, every moment of self-doubt, and every subtle betrayal I had endured. Writing brought clarity. It was like untangling knots I hadn't realized had been tightening for years. One afternoon, a former colleague from my old job reached out. She wanted advice on navigating similar challenges. As I spoke to her over the phone, I realized I could articulate lessons I had learned only through lived experience. I was no longer defined by the silence I had maintained. I was defined by the choices I had made after the silence ended. That conversation marked a turning point in my perception of the past. I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I began seeing the old experiences as preparation, not punishment. The unfairness I endured had taught me patience, discernment, and the courage to protect my own integrity. In those months, I also confronted lingering guilt. I had often felt guilty for prioritizing my well-being over blind loyalty to a company or a boss. But slowly, I realized that protecting my mental and emotional health was not selfish. It was necessary. Without it, I could not have been present for my family or capable of meaningful work elsewhere. As time passed, I found balance. I could work hard without letting work define me. I could support my family without feeling drained. I could be ambitious without allowing ambition to silence my voice. One Sunday, I was sitting in the backyard with my wife, watching our children play. The sun was warm, the air crisp. For the first time in years, I felt completely present. I didn't think it would feel this peaceful, I said. She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. It's because you finally stopped trying to survive everyone else's expectations and started living for yourself. I thought about Daniel, about the years of invisibility and quiet frustration. I didn't feel bitterness anymore, only understanding. I had grown stronger because of it, not in spite of the experience, but because I allowed myself to learn from it. The rebuilding wasn't instant. Some days were harder than others. Doubt still crept in, but I had developed tools to manage it. I had learned to recognize when fear was just a habit and when it was a signal to reassess. I had learned that resilience was not about enduring endlessly, but about making conscious choices for one's own well-being. I also started mentoring others quietly, guiding them through challenges without taking over, encouraging them to speak up, to protect their ideas, to maintain their integrity. In helping them, I reinforced lessons I had learned for myself. I realized that success could be measured in more ways than recognition or advancement. True success was being able to look at yourself in the mirror each day and know you had acted with honesty, fairness, and self-respect. That kind of success didn't need applause. It needed only acknowledgement from within. Months turned into a year. My life had shifted in subtle but profound ways. My children saw a father who was present and attentive. My wife saw a partner who could be both strong and vulnerable. My colleagues saw someone who contributed meaningfully without sacrificing himself. And I finally understood that the deepest value of all my struggles wasn't the lessons themselves, but the awareness they gave me, awareness that I could choose, that I could act, and that I could reclaim what had been quietly eroded over years. Every morning now, when I wake up and step into my day, I do so with a calm certainty. I don't need validation from others to feel worth. I don't need the approval of a boss to feel competent. I have regained something far more important: the right to respect myself, to honor my contributions, and to live fully in my own life. For the first time in a very long time, I feel whole. Even after I left my old job, the past didn't disappear. It lingered in quiet moments, in reflections, in conversations where I had to remind myself not to shrink or apologize for the weight I had carried for years. The memories weren't just about Daniel or the office politics. They were about me, about all the times I had allowed silence to replace my voice, about all the opportunities one had missed because I valued comfort over confrontation. Some days, the memories arrived like a shadow crossing the sun. I'd be making breakfast or folding laundry, and suddenly I'd remember a moment I had buried, a presentation where my name was erased, an idea that was celebrated as someone else's, a time I had said nothing when I should have spoken, and for a split second, I would feel the old familiar tightness in my chest. It was during one of these afternoons that I finally admitted something to myself. The anger I had long buried wasn't entirely gone. It had changed shape. It wasn't the fiery, impulsive anger that demands shouting or revenge. It was a quiet, simmering resentment, a shadow of what had been, waiting to be confronted and understood. I went back to journaling that day, more deliberately than ever. I wrote about the years of invisibility, the moments when I had felt small, the nights I had questioned my worth. I wrote about the times I had chosen survival over truth, comfort over confrontation. I wrote until the paper was filled, until the ink reflected all the silent frustration I had carried alone. And as I wrote, I realized something profound. My past didn't define me. My response to it did. I could choose to carry resentment, and allow it to fester, or I could use it as a lens to understand myself, my values, and my boundaries. A few days later, I decided to reach out to a former coworker who had been one of the few allies I'd had during those years. We met at a small coffee shop, and for the first time, I spoke openly about everything. The long days, the erased credit, the moments I had doubted myself. She listened patiently, nodding, her eyes reflecting both understanding and sadness. "You did what you could at the time," she said finally. "And you survived. That takes more courage than most people realize." Her words settled into me. They didn't erase the past, but they softened it. They reminded me that even in silence, I had acted with integrity in the ways I could. I hadn't compromised my values entirely. I had merely been cautious. And caution, in its own quiet way, had kept me afloat until I could take the leap to reclaim my voice. After that meeting, I began confronting my memories more intentionally. I revisited the moments I had labeled as failures and began reframing them. The presentation where Daniel took credit? It was proof that I had vision and initiative. The projects where my contributions went unnoticed? Evidence that I had consistency, skill, and patience. Every slight, every erasure, every silent endurance had been training for the life I was now building. I started sharing these reflections with my family, not to relive pain, but to model resilience. One evening, I told my children about a project I had poured my heart into years ago. Sometimes, even when you work hard and do your best, recognition comes to someone else, I said. But that doesn't make your work less important. What matters is knowing you did it well and learning to trust yourself. They listened quietly, their eyes wide, and I realized I was teaching them something I hadn't fully learned myself. That worth isn't determined by external acknowledgement, but by the honesty of effort and the integrity of action. Work continued in my new role, steady but meaningful. I faced new challenges, technical problems, difficult colleagues, and deadlines that tested me. But I no longer carried the weight of invisible labor or stolen credit. I faced obstacles head-on, and when I faltered, I gave myself grace. I had learned that grace, for oneself, is as important as discipline or ambition. Yet, despite the progress, some days were still haunted by what-ifs. What if I had spoken sooner? What if I had stood my ground in that pivotal meeting? What if I had recognized my worth earlier? One evening, sitting alone on the back porch, I allowed myself to feel it all. The regret, the pain, the loss. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I forgave myself. Not for being perfect, not for avoiding confrontation, but for doing the best I could with the understanding I had at the time. For staying upright in a system that tried to erase me. For continuing to care, even when no one else seemed to notice. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it changed my relationship to it. The memories no longer felt like chains. They felt like signposts, reminders of lessons learned and resilience earned. A few weeks later, I had a phone call with a recruiter from a larger firm. They were impressed by my new accomplishments and my approach to leadership. I considered the opportunity carefully. For the first time, I realized I wasn't motivated solely by status or recognition. I was motivated by respect, fairness, and work that mattered. When I declined the call, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of clarity. I was no longer building a career for validation. I was building it for purpose. In those months, I also began helping friends and younger colleagues navigate similar challenges. I didn't give them easy answers, but I shared my story. I shared the quiet struggles, the mistakes, the slow realizations. And I watched as my honesty empowered them to recognize their own worth and speak up when needed. Through reflection, forgiveness, and action, I realized a truth I had long avoided. The past does not vanish. But how we carry it, how we learn from it, and how we allow it to shape us without defining us, that is entirely our choice. Sitting at my desk one morning, sunlight streaming through the window, I smiled at a report I had completed. It was just a simple success, but this time, I owned it fully. No one had taken credit. No one had diminished my role. I had contributed, and that contribution mattered. And in that moment, I understood. The work I do, the life I live, the voice I reclaim, all of it matters not because others acknowledge it, but because I do. For the first time in years, the shadows of the past no longer loomed over me. They existed, yes, but they were behind me. I had stepped forward. I had chosen myself. And that choice, above all else, was the foundation for everything I would build moving forward. The months after leaving my old job were not filled with sudden triumph or drama. They were quiet, slow, ordinary, and in that ordinariness, I found the beginning of real healing. I started noticing things I had long ignored. The way sunlight poured through our living room window in the morning, the smell of coffee brewing, the laughter of my children, unprompted by me, filling the space. These small, overlooked moments were grounding. They reminded me that life existed outside of meetings, deadlines, and stolen credit. I also noticed my own reactions, my emotional responses. Where once I had been reactive, defensive, or silently resentful, I now found space to pause, to choose how to respond, to ask myself if my words, my energy, and my attention were being invested in the right places. It was a discipline I hadn't practiced for years, and it felt strange at first, like learning to walk again. At work, I approached each project differently. I kept detailed notes of my contributions, not out of fear, but as a personal record. I set boundaries early, clarifying expectations without aggression or apology. I realized that protecting my work, my time, and my mental health was not selfish. It was necessary. And when I did this consistently, respect followed naturally. Not recognition for recognition's sake, but a genuine acknowledgement of effort and competence. Home life mirrored this shift. I spent more evenings with my children. I asked questions about their day, their hopes, their struggles, without letting distractions creep in. I played board games, helped with projects, and listened when they had something to say, even if it seemed trivial. And in these moments, I realized that my silence at work had cost me more than just professional recognition. It had cost me presence in my own life. I began to repair my relationships in subtle ways. Not because they were broken beyond repair, but because I had been absent in ways I hadn't acknowledged. With my wife, I started sharing not only the big thoughts or frustrations, but the little things, the fleeting joys, the concerns about our children, the quiet reflections on life. She responded with patience, gratitude, and love, and I realized that connection had been waiting for me to be fully present. One evening, my daughter came to me with a school project. She was proud, but hesitant, clearly seeking my approval. I listened attentively, helped where I could, and praised her effort honestly. Later, as she hugged me goodnight, I felt the weight of years of absence lifting slightly. I also began setting boundaries with friends and colleagues. People who had relied on me for emotional labor, favors, or unspoken support were gently reminded of my limits. I discovered that saying no was not rejection, it was self-preservation, and the world did not collapse because of it. In fact, relationships became clearer, healthier, and more honest. Part of my healing involved confronting lingering self-doubt. For years, I had questioned my competence, my value, and even my worthiness of respect. These doubts were echoes of my old workplace, amplified by years of silent compliance. Slowly, I practiced challenging them. I reminded myself of my achievements, the quality of my work, and the value of my contributions. I celebrated small victories privately, without waiting for validation from others. Financially, leaving my old job had been a risk. There were moments of anxiety, when bills arrived, or when my savings dwindled more quickly than I liked. But I discovered resilience I hadn't known I had. I learned to budget carefully, to prioritize, to accept imperfection without shame. And in that process, I realized that security is not just external. It is rooted in adaptability, prudence, and confidence in one's own judgment. At work, new opportunities began to emerge naturally. People sought my input because they recognized thoughtfulness and competence. I was invited to contribute to projects early, not just to implement tasks, but to shape outcomes. And I began mentoring others who were facing situations I had once endured. I shared lessons about speaking up, maintaining integrity, and valuing oneself. In teaching, I found a new sense of purpose and validation that was quiet but deeply fulfilling. Evenings became moments of reflection rather than exhaustion. I journaled regularly, not just about work or struggles, but about life, growth, and gratitude. I recorded memories I didn't want to forget, observations I didn't want to lose. Through this, I discovered that healing is not a destination, it is a practice. Each day, each choice, each acknowledgement of self-worth is a step forward. Slowly, I began to forgive, not just Daniel or my former colleagues, but myself. for staying silent, for believing that patience alone would protect me, for years of self-doubt that had grown unchecked. Forgiveness was not about absolution or erasing the past. It was about reclaiming energy that had been spent on guilt and regret. I also reflected on the lessons I wanted to carry forward, that speaking up does not make one selfish, that boundaries are essential for health and respect, that recognition is valuable, but self-recognition is essential, that integrity, once compromised, diminishes life quietly, but integrity reclaimed restores it quietly too. By the time a year had passed, I realized I had transformed in ways that were invisible to outsiders but profoundly real for me. I was calmer, more intentional, present in ways I hadn't been for years. I had built a life that prioritized meaning over appearances, presence over approval, and self-respect over silent compliance. One afternoon, my wife and I sat on the porch, watching our children play in the yard. I felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes not from perfection, but from having navigated chaos and emerged intact. I feel like we've finally caught up to ourselves, I said. She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. We did. It just took time. And she was right. Healing is not immediate. It is not always linear. But it is possible when you acknowledge the past, reclaim your voice, and allow yourself to live fully in the present. The shadows of my old job, my old fears, and my old self were still there, occasionally rising in memory. But now, I could face them without fear. They no longer defined me. They were reminders of lessons learned, not chains that bound me. I had rebuilt my life, quietly but firmly. I had repaired relationships, reclaimed my presence, and discovered a resilience I hadn't recognized before. And in the quiet moments, I realized that all the struggles, all the erasures, all the silent endurance had led me here, not broken, not defeated, but whole. By the time I had been in my new role for nearly 2 years, I realized something remarkable. Life felt quieter, not in a way that was boring or stagnant, but in a way that was intentional, controlled, and deeply satisfying. I no longer measured myself by how much work I could do silently, how many tasks I could shoulder without acknowledgement, or how much I could endure in the name of loyalty. I measured myself by impact, by integrity, and by presence. Each morning, I woke up with a rhythm that belonged to me. Coffee in hand, I walked into the home office, where sunlight spilled across the desk. I checked emails, not obsessively, but with purpose. I planned my day deliberately, allowing space for creativity, problem-solving, and mentoring colleagues. I could focus fully because I no longer carried the invisible burden of fear, resentment, or erasure. Mentoring became one of the most rewarding parts of my new role. People came to me quietly, unsure if their voices mattered or if their contributions would be acknowledged. And I listened. I shared what I had learned. The importance of asserting oneself, of documenting contributions, of setting boundaries. I told them about my experience with Daniel, not as a cautionary tale to scare them, but as an example of navigating unfairness while protecting integrity. One afternoon, a young colleague asked me, "How did you stay patient for so long?" I thought for a moment before replying. Patience is not always about waiting. It's about observing, learning, and preparing. But it is never a substitute for action. Sometimes you have to choose yourself, even if it's scary. She nodded slowly, and I saw a sense of relief in her eyes. I realized then that my past, once a source of frustration and pain, had become a tool to guide others. My experiences, which had felt wasted, were now purposeful. At home, the changes were even more profound. I had reclaimed a presence that had been absent for years. I attended parent-teacher conferences, volunteered for school events, and spent long weekends exploring parks, museums, and hobbies with my children. I wasn't just physically present. I was mentally and emotionally there, sharing in their excitement, guiding their curiosity, and helping them navigate challenges. My relationship with my wife deepened as well. We had always shared love and commitment, but now, without the shadow of constant stress and exhaustion, our partnership became more intentional. We communicated openly about hopes, fears, and dreams. We learned to support each other without judgment, to share burdens without resentment, and to celebrate achievements without comparison. I also began to recognize the value of quiet victories. Completing a complex project successfully, seeing a colleague succeed with guidance I had offered, helping my children feel confident in themselves. These moments weren't celebrated with applause or fanfare, but they carried a weight far more meaningful than any recognition I had once craved. Even financial stability, which had caused anxiety when I left my old job, became less of a source of stress and more of a tool for freedom. I learned to manage our household with care, to save prudently, and to invest time and energy where it mattered most. I realized that security is not only about money. It's about having the space and autonomy to make choices without fear. During quiet evenings, I reflected often on my journey. I thought about Daniel, about the office where I had been invisible, about the years I had endured silently. I no longer felt bitterness. Instead, I felt gratitude for the lessons learned, for the resilience developed, and for the clarity that emerged. The experience had forced me to confront my limits, define my boundaries, and understand the value of my own voice. I also recognized a subtle but profound change in my self-perception. I no longer equated effort with worth or visibility with value. I had learned that dignity is earned in how you act, not in how others perceive you. I had learned that patience is valuable, but courage is necessary. And I had learned that self-respect, once surrendered, cannot be reclaimed without conscious choice. One evening, as I sat with my wife watching the children play in the yard, I realized how far I had come. The weight I had carried for over a decade, the silent endurance, the unrecognized effort, the frustration and doubt, had been replaced by clarity, presence, and purpose. I had learned to navigate life with awareness rather than mere survival. I began to dream again, not about promotions or prestige, but about meaningful contributions, personal growth, and experiences that enriched our family life. I enrolled in a professional development course, not because it would impress anyone, but because it expanded my knowledge and confidence. I took up hobbies I had neglected, painting and writing, which allowed me to process emotions creatively. Even setbacks now felt different. When challenges arose, I approached them with calm deliberation rather than panic or self-doubt. I acknowledged mistakes, corrected them, and moved forward without allowing them to define my worth. I no longer feared failure in the way I once had. I understood that failure is not a reflection of value, but a step in the process of growth. Gradually, I noticed subtle shifts in the people around me. Colleagues respected my voice. My children saw me as reliable and engaged. My wife trusted me as a partner in both practical and emotional life. Friends appreciated my honesty and calm perspective. And I noticed something else. I was learning to respect myself, fully and without hesitation. It was during one quiet afternoon that I had a realization. My journey wasn't just about leaving a toxic environment. It was about reclaiming my life, one deliberate choice at a time. The lessons of patience, courage, and self-respect had become habits, shaping not just my career, but my family, my relationships, and my sense of identity. I understood now that life is less about avoiding mistakes or enduring silently and more about choosing authenticity, even when it feels risky. The peace I felt wasn't the absence of difficulty. It was the presence of integrity, the clarity of choice, and the acceptance of self. In my journal that evening, I wrote, "I have learned that being heard is not always about speaking loudly. Being valued is not always about recognition. Being whole is about acknowledging yourself, choosing your path, and living with integrity. That is freedom." And as I closed my journal, I felt a quiet satisfaction that was deeper than any praise, recognition, or reward I had ever received. It was a satisfaction born of truth, presence, and purpose, the culmination of a journey that had started in silence and frustration and had ended in clarity and empowerment. By this stage in my life, I had come to understand that the most profound lessons often arrive quietly, not in dramatic moments, but in the steady rhythm of daily life. The years of struggle, of silence, of feeling invisible at work, had taught me truths I would carry forever, truths that shaped how I lived, how I worked, and how I loved. I began to notice patterns I had never recognized before. People who take credit for others' work often do so out of fear, not malice. Those who seem unappreciative may be blind to effort, not indifferent to value. And most importantly, no one can define your worth for you. Recognition from others is gratifying, yes, but it is never a replacement for internal acknowledgement and self-respect. I also reflected on patience. For years, I had equated patience with silence. waiting for the world to notice me. But patience alone, I learned, is not enough. It must be paired with courage, the courage to speak, the courage to set boundaries, and the courage to walk away when circumstances threaten your dignity. At work, I applied these lessons daily. I voiced my opinions early, not aggressively, but assertively. I documented my contributions not because I feared erasure, but because I valued clarity. I supported colleagues without sacrificing myself, and I mentored others to do the same, sharing insights I had learned through hard experience. Watching younger professionals gain confidence, see their work recognized, and learn to assert themselves gave me a deep sense of fulfillment I had never experienced in my old career. At home, the lessons were equally vital. I realized that family presence is not just about physical proximity. It is about attention, empathy, and active participation. I began scheduling regular one-on-one time with my children, listening to their concerns, celebrating their successes, and guiding them through mistakes without judgment. My wife and I became partners in the truest sense, communicating openly about our feelings, responsibilities, and dreams. This partnership deepened our bond and modeled healthy relationships for our children. Forgiveness became a cornerstone of my healing. I forgave Daniel, not because he deserved it, but because I no longer wanted the past to dictate my emotions. I forgave myself for the years of silence, for doubting my abilities, and for undervaluing my own voice. Forgiveness freed me to move forward without resentment, allowing me to reclaim energy and focus for the life I wanted to live. Through these reflections, I also learned humility. I understood that success is never entirely solitary. It requires collaboration, learning from mistakes, and the willingness to grow continuously. Yet, humility is not synonymous with invisibility. One can be humble while asserting value, advocating for contributions, and claiming one's rightful space in any environment. Financially and professionally, I discovered a new principle. Stability is not only about security, but about autonomy. Having control over one's choices, even if the path is unconventional or uncertain, is more empowering than climbing a ladder for recognition alone. I learned to weigh decisions not by prestige, but by alignment with my values, my family's needs, and my mental and emotional well-being. One afternoon, as I walked home from work, I reflected on the long journey, the years of stress, invisibility, and exhaustion. I realized that every hardship had been a teacher in disguise. Each struggle had built resilience, self-awareness, and clarity about what truly mattered. The professional setbacks, once sources of frustration, had become markers of growth. The personal strain, once a source of guilt, had become a reminder of priorities that deserved protection. I also began to articulate a philosophy I would carry forward. Life is not about enduring invisibility or waiting for acknowledgement. It is about choosing integrity over approval, courage over complacency, and presence over distraction. By living these principles, one creates a life defined not by external validation, but by internal truth. In conversations with my children, I started sharing pieces of this philosophy gently. You will meet people who don't see your value, I told them one evening. That doesn't mean you have less. It means you need to be brave enough to recognize it yourself and patient enough to act in your own best interest. My wife and I reinforced these lessons in our marriage. We discussed how to navigate workplace challenges, financial decisions, and social pressures without losing sight of our values. We acknowledged that life would always present difficulties, but facing them together, with honesty and mutual respect, made them manageable. Mentoring became a central part of my sense of purpose. I worked with colleagues struggling with recognition, fairness, or professional growth. I shared practical advice, strategies for documenting contributions, approaches to assertiveness, and methods for maintaining personal integrity even in challenging environments. Through these interactions, I realized that my past experiences, once painful and humiliating, were now invaluable tools to help others. I also learned the importance of celebrating small victories. I had once dismissed minor successes, believing only grand accomplishments mattered. Now, I cherish them. Completing a challenging project, guiding a colleague to success, enjoying a family outing. These moments, I realized, were the true measure of a fulfilled life. Health and well-being became priorities. I exercised regularly, practiced mindfulness, and allowed time for rest. I noticed how physical, mental, and emotional health were interconnected. Without balance, no amount of professional or personal achievement could bring genuine satisfaction. I also confronted my relationship with fear. For years, fear had dictated decisions. Fear of confrontation, fear of loss, fear of failure. I learned to acknowledge fear without allowing it to dominate. Fear became a compass, signaling areas that required attention, rather than a barrier preventing action. Reflecting on all these lessons, I began to see the entirety of my journey as a series of deliberate steps towards self-realization. Leaving my old job had been a turning point, but the real work, the healing, rebuilding, and reclaiming, had been ongoing and subtle. It required courage, patience, reflection, and persistence. One evening, I sat quietly on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My children laughed in the distance. My wife sipped her tea beside me. I felt a profound sense of peace, not because life was perfect, but because I had reclaimed agency over it. I understood that the past would always exist, the mistakes, the erasures, the long years of silence, but it no longer held power over me. I had integrated those experiences into a coherent understanding of myself. They were no longer wounds, but guides, no longer sources of resentment, but markers of growth. As I closed my eyes that evening, I realized a truth I had long avoided. Life's challenges are inevitable, but suffering is optional. It is not the difficulties themselves, but our response to them, that shapes our character and our destiny. I had endured, learned, healed, and grown. And in doing so, I had found something more valuable than recognition, more lasting than success, more fulfilling than approval. I had found peace. The final months of my journey felt different from anything I had experienced before. There were no crises, no dramatic confrontations, no sudden moments of triumph. Instead, there was a quiet unfolding, a sense of life returning to its natural rhythm, like a river slowly finding its course after years of obstruction. It was steady, deliberate, and profoundly satisfying. I woke each morning with intention rather than obligation. I made coffee while the house was still quiet, listened to the birds outside, and allowed myself time to reflect before engaging with the world. The constant anxiety that had once driven me to work late into the night, sacrificing health and family moments, had diminished. It was replaced by clarity, focus, and calm. I knew where I was, what I valued, and how I wanted to live. At work, I had fully embraced my new role. I no longer measured success by recognition from superiors or comparisons with colleagues. I measured it by the integrity of my work, the respect I showed and received, and the quiet satisfaction of contributing meaningfully to projects that mattered. I documented my achievements, not obsessively, but as a personal record of effort and growth. I celebrated the small wins, the projects that went smoothly, the problems solved thoughtfully. Each of these moments reminded me that significance is not always public. Sometimes it is private, internal, and deeply fulfilling. Mentoring became one of my greatest sources of purpose. I worked with colleagues navigating challenges I had once faced: uncertainty, undervaluation, and the fear of speaking up. I shared lessons I had learned the hard way: the importance of clear communication, asserting contributions without aggression, and maintaining personal boundaries. I spoke about the dangers of silence, about the subtle power of documenting your work, and about the courage it takes to leave environments that diminish your worth. In their growth, I saw my own journey reflected and validated. At home, the transformation was equally profound. I spent more time with my children, truly present. I listened actively, engaged fully, and shared moments that had once passed unnoticed. We played games, explored outdoors, cooked together, and laughed freely. The guilt that had accumulated from years of absence and overwork gradually melted, replaced by connection and shared experiences that built lasting bonds. My relationship with my wife deepened as well. We learned to communicate with honesty and empathy, sharing both joy and concern without fear of judgment. We celebrated accomplishments together and navigated challenges as a team. The partnership we had once taken for granted now thrived on mutual respect and understanding. It was not dramatic, but it was profound. Financial and career stability had improved, but I no longer measured my life by salary or status. I realized that true security comes from self-reliance, preparedness, and alignment with one's values. Autonomy, I learned, is worth more than prestige. I made decisions based on purpose, growth, and well-being rather than fear or approval. Even setbacks now were different. Challenges arose, of course, but they were met with calm reflection rather than panic or self-doubt. Mistakes became opportunities for learning. Problems became chances to apply knowledge and integrity. Fear no longer dictated my actions. It became a guide, highlighting areas that needed attention rather than a barrier to progress. The shadows of my past, the years of silent endurance, unrecognized effort, and subtle erasure, still existed. Occasionally, memories of Daniel or my old office would surface, but they no longer carried power. They were lessons embedded in experience, proof of resilience, growth, and self-assertion. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my life. I found new ways to challenge myself. I pursued professional development, learning new skills that expanded both my competence and confidence. I explored personal interests I had long neglected, writing, painting, and quiet hobbies that allowed me to process emotions and celebrate creativity. Each endeavor reinforced the idea that life is multifaceted, and growth comes not just from work or external validation, but from cultivating the mind, heart, and soul. I also reflected on the broader meaning of my experiences. Life had taught me that dignity cannot be granted by others. It must be claimed. Recognition is valuable, but self-recognition is essential. Courage is not absence of fear, but action despite it. Integrity is the foundation on which a meaningful life is built, even when unseen or unacknowledged. One quiet evening, I sat with my wife on the porch as our children played nearby. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. I felt a deep sense of peace, one that had nothing to do with external validation, professional titles, or material success. It was rooted in clarity, presence, and self-respect. I feel like we finally have a life we chose, I said. She smiled, squeezing my hand gently. It's because we did, and because you stopped letting fear and silence control you. I realized then that every struggle, every moment of invisibility, every challenge I had faced, had led me to this place. Not to wealth, acclaim, or victory, but to freedom, clarity, and meaningful connection. The lessons I carried were simple, yet profound. Speak up, even when it feels uncomfortable. Protect your integrity and your time. Recognize your contributions, privately or publicly. Set boundaries without guilt. Allow yourself to leave situations that diminish your value. Cherish relationships through presence, empathy, and honesty. Embrace mistakes and setbacks as opportunities for growth. Celebrate quiet victories. Live deliberately, aligned with your values. And above all, recognize that self-respect and inner clarity are more powerful than external approval. I had learned that life does not always offer dramatic moments of vindication or triumph. Often, it offers something quieter, yet infinitely more valuable. The ability to reclaim oneself, to act intentionally, and to live with integrity. As night fell, I watched my family around me and felt a sense of gratitude deeper than any I had known. The past was still there, but it no longer defined me. The future was uncertain, as it always is, but I felt ready to face it with calm, courage, and clarity. For the first time in years, I could say with quiet confidence, I am present. I am heard. I am valued, not because others acknowledge it, but because I recognize it. I have reclaimed my life, piece by piece, choice by choice, lesson by lesson. And that, more than anything else, is what makes life worth living.